My name is Prashan, and I'm on panel B.
Great. Okay. So I'll be timing. I do encourage you to time yourselves and time others. Please do your speaking order in chat. Inviting Prime Minister.
Sorry, can I confirm that you can hear me properly?
Yeah.
Okay. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, pure eyes verbally, please. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. Panel, the decline of unipolarity has led to the rise of multipolarity and as a result has destabilized the international system by creating, firstly, an active incentive for conflict and intensifying security dilemmas among greater powers, which has led directly to global instability, ideological clashes and fragmentation, as well as the use of smaller states as proxies for war. We think it's important, firstly, that we establish that this debate is not about whether or not the United States of America is a good actor, because we don't think there's any world in which any of the superpowers or any unipolar actor would act in a benevolent manner in any way. This debate, however, is about in which world we're able to maintain global peace, and this opening government, we're going to do 4 things to show you why global peace is better maintained on our side. But firstly, a bit of framing on what global peace actually looks like. We think firstly, global peace looks like an absence of war, where we don't have like large scale interstate war, or we don't have like massive clusters of like proxy wars and small wars happening between smaller states or like smaller tribes within countries. We think secondly, it looks like having actual positive peace frameworks that look like economic equity, that look like institutional and governmental functionality, where we have credible global institutions that have the capacity to solve crises timely, and there exists a level of like predictability and trust on those institutions. We think the decline of unipolarity has become a threat to global peace because it actively threatens these things. What we want to argue is that the United States of America, in all its badness that both teams on opening opposition can talk about, has been able and has actively ensured that like global peace is something that has been achieved. And the shifting context of like this new multipolar nature is what has led in the majority of circumstances to the multiple wars that we've encountered. 3 things then on why we win this debate. We think firstly, it's important to understand that the disruption of global peace is something that has found itself to be inevitable in the majority of circumstances. What has happened, however, is that the United States of America, particularly post the Cold War, was able to prevent the escalations of these wars that were coming up in all these different places, because they had that supply of control over global trade, they had a supply of control over like the global like arms capacity for different states, and there was no actor that could counteract sort of whatever the United States of America had decided was the resolution to particular issues. We think this is something that led to amicable resolutions that were, for the most important part, resolutions that could be reached more timely. In a multipolar context, which is like post-1991 till present, what we've seen is rapid changes in allegiance and rapid changes in alliances world over, which has increasingly like worsened or made worse the difficulty of like predicting behavior or being able to come to a unified conclusion in like contexts such as the United Nations and so on and so forth. We think at this point, voting to end the genocide that is happening in Palestine or voting to end the war in Ukraine is no longer just about the moral decision that actors make to vote to end a conflict or to vote to end a war, but it's about which state you're aligning yourself with because of like the trade deals that you're better able to get. And we think this is something that actively like affects the way in which individuals can exist, or in the way in which the states are able to sort of like propagate themselves and become better. We think secondly, what we've seen is a very toxic creation of small spheres of influence, which within themselves have become very toxic, right? This is why this happens. We think this decline in unipolarity has created a massive power vacuum, and different states have come into play and have come to push their own agendas and different ideologies on like governance, and have tried to like establish themselves as the individual states that fill up that power vacuum. This is something that is particularly problematic because in the very first instance, it creates an incentive for individual states to interfere in various proxy wars, right? So that they, like newer powers such as China and newer powers such as Russia, can maximize on their own political, economic, and military power, right? This is because these states are actively involved in the arms race as a way of like entrenching their dominance in terms of like how the global decisions are made, and entrenching their dominance in terms of like the decisions that are being made at a bigger scale. This is something that wouldn't exist in a unipolar context because there's no incentive whatsoever for any state to sort of entrench their own ideology, or for any state to be the state that is like majority of the states pledging their allegiance to it. We think this active creation of a problem that otherwise wouldn't have existed in a unipolar context is something that is the bigger threat to is something that is a bigger threat to the peace that is existing, to the peace that is existing, or to peace like that is actively existed, right? Which is something that actively then threatens global peace. And for those reasons, we do believe that the decline of unipolarity is something that we cannot accept. We think thirdly, it's important to evaluate the economic outcomes that we have within status quo, right? We think in a unipolar context, you're able to guarantee like some level of enforcement of equality within like the smaller states that are existing, right? I will concede at this point in time that there's obviously an incentive for like the United States of America as the only global superpower to be able to continue to maintain being like that global superpower, or an incentive for the United States of America to sort of be able to control trade and be able to control like all these different channels that actually exist. The reason why this is a context that is better, and the reason why this is something that we're able to deal with, is because there's no active incentive when there's a unipolar environment for the United States of America to actively fight against China, for example, or to actively fight against Russia or any other up and coming state, so that they maintain their perceived level of power. We think when there's threats that are like challenged, or when there's challenges that are like inflicted on like the standing of the United States of America, only then do you create that active incentive for them to act in a manner that is even less benevolent than they otherwise would have, right? We think this decline then of unipolarity is something that has actively fragmented global supply chains, and it's something that we definitely cannot accept. Why we believe the decline of unipolarity is something that threatens global peace is it's because it's something that shifts
to understand why this works is when you look at what the United States is doing in the Middle East. They believe that they are the only state that has the capacity to actually create peace around the world, and therefore they can come into this particular region, take over these particular resources, this particular place, under the guise, especially of protecting peace and interested in creating some level of stability and civilization within these particular nations. The problem with this, and this is why we actually support this particular rejection of this narrative, is that it empowers these particular vulnerable states to actually reject these narratives insofar as these narratives are the ones that cause destabilization. When these powerful unipolar states actually enter into these particular spaces, they dilute cultures, they change doctrines, they destroy religions and reinforce narratives that they are the dominant actor, that the only ones who have the solutions to these particular problems, and therefore these are the people you should welcome inside. The issue with this particular unipolar narrative is that these states often have incredibly malicious incentives around them. They're interested probably in exploiting your resources. They're interested in probably purveying their power and improving their global positioning. These are all the reasons that are then making this particular action incredibly bad in status quo, which is why we particularly oppose this thing from opening opposition. What then does global peace look like so that we can understand and perform a proper threat analysis on it, unlike what opening government has given us? It looks like three things: relative global economic stability that is existent in status quo, nuclear deterrence still exists, demilitarization efforts around the world, and more importantly, like I said in my opening statement, more universal equity mechanisms that exist in status quo. The reason why this is important, Chair, and I want you to listen carefully, is that it only happens when people have access to these particular resources. People don't fight because they're interested in fighting. They don't kill each other because they're interested in killing their brothers, destroying their neighbors, and taking over the identity of these particular individuals. They fight because of the scarcity of resources that exist in status quo. Or when and they only stop fighting when fighting seems impossible due to the deterrence, and then they perform that cost-benefit analysis in game theory of why it is disadvantageous to fight. But even more importantly, they're only then going to stop fighting when they recognize that there is nobody out to get you. There is some level of balance and stability. These three things cannot exist in a unipolar world intrinsically. What then does a non-unipolar world look like that then forms the crux of our support from opening opposition? I think and this is just an intrinsic rebuttal to an integrated rebuttal to opening government, a new power vacuum. We must be forced to see a new world order where we redefine what it means to dominate the global economy. It looks like entities that are globalized and have conversations of multiple people seated around a table then dominate these conversations. It looks like empowering entities like the United Nations and that address more globalized efforts, empowering regional blocs simply because they're more proximate to people. And the reason why this is particularly important and why it's going to lead to more global peace is because globalized efforts, things like climate change that require multilateral efforts that could be stifled by the unilateral veto powers that are existing within the unipolar world, then go out the window simply because people then are going to recognize that for the benefit of all humanity, this is then what is more important to protect these particular states. People are going to be interested in fighting less simply because they feel like most of the incentives are met, especially by entities that are more proximate to them, that understand their lived experiences more importantly. But even secondly, accountability among states is heightened in this particular world that we are proposing, simply because of the concept of mutually assured destruction, to the extent that you know that the world, let's use a simple intuition for you to understand this. Nuclear war is something that does not happen today, especially in the era of people like Trump existing in status quo, simply because the United States knows that other nations have nukes. That's the only reason why people are not bombing each other. That is the only reason why that level of accountability exists there. Note, the states are not changing their incentives. They're not intrinsically changing how they behave. What we want them to do and what world benefits them is where all of them are given a seat at the table, where they don't have to fight for it, where they don't have to feel like for their existence and for their capacity to thrive, they must impose on the other entity so that they feel like their capacity and their expansion is something that is not under threat. But even thirdly, there's relatively balanced bargaining power that exists among these particular states, which is important insofar as it improves their capacity for negotiations for things like loans, institutions that have targeted and destroyed communities, especially for like third world nations, things like the IMF. These particular entities then, for states, then have more capacity to engage more proximately and more equitably with these particular entities. And the reason why this is because the generation of revenue that is intrinsically required for development is what actually causes these fights, is what causes global instability. We then save all of the resources and time that is taken to fight for these resources. But before that, I'll take closing gap. Closing gap. PG. Right. The chart here is very simple, Chair. Is this decline better or worse for peace across the world? We argue from opening opposition that is particularly better for a couple of reasons here. Intrinsically, unipolarity is an entity. Unipolarity as a way of life, as a system of governance, seeks to entrench dominance of one actor over the other. This then means intrinsically and inherently, in principle, will always create some war, simply because everybody will be fighting for that top seat. The word we are arguing for from opening opposition breaks down that entire complete narrative, and that is what creates and entrenches global peace. Two layers of analysis for you to buy this. The new world order that is created has more incentive to keep the peace for these particular individuals. We mentioned things like the United Nations that's interested in the prosperity of humanity, interested in protecting people's actions across board, and is interested in, for example, having less militarization around the world through things like the Disarmament Charter and the treaties around the same. These are organizations that are more incentivized to protect the interests of the people. But even if we move on beyond those agencies and those organizations, as states themselves, they're less incentivized to fight when they feel like they have an equitable say, when they feel like they have a slice of the proverbial untouchable pie that has existed, of resources that has existed in status quo for a long time. But even more importantly, to maintain unipolarity is going to be at the expense of this particular global power in and of of other global powers in and of themselves. Insofar as the state is going to be interested, the unipolar state is going to be interested in entrenching its dominance by suppressing the experiences of other actors that status quo, stepping on their agency and making sure that they do not have a voice, they do not have a choice, ultimately limiting their happiness in status quo. Never been prouder to put opposition.
Thanks, Alo. Reminding everyone, 7:15, inviting DPM.
Cool. Can I just confirm that I'm audible? Is that a yes?
You're audible.
Okay, great, thanks. I'll take my PRs in the chat, so just drop them in there. Give me a second to set up my timer. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3,
Hi,
2.
Speaker. Sorry, Speaker. Could you pause?
What's up?
All right. So, my partner is complaining that they can't hear what's happening in the round. So I was just wondering if you could hold on a bit while they try to correct this issue. I don't know what the policy is, but cheers. Could we just have some extra time so that they rectify this issue?
They reconnect.
Okay, yeah. So Smart, he probably can't hear me. Let me text him. Smart, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm really sorry, guys. If the yeah. Can anyone hear him?
No, we can't.
Okay.
I'm sorry, and here some. It's gonna be just like some
Alright.
time.
Hold on.
Maybe you can just give that tries as well and we see if it can work. Or if they have like another gadget, like a laptop, maybe they can use that.
Let me just
Or they
tell
can
them
like
that.
try also using Discord web.
Okay, sure. But when the time elapses, please DPM, you can just continue. Don't worry. We'll sort ourselves out.
So, Brian, is it like 3 minutes of disconnection, or what's the policy?
Yeah, if 3 minutes are done, you can just like press it to find us.
Fair enough. I think one person from O has disconnected, anyways. Jeff, your partner is not here.
So do I start or?
Yeah, just give me one moment. Like DLO is not, I guess, not here because I see that they have dropped from the call. Oh,
All right.
What? DLU is here.
yeah. Okay. No stress then. DPM, you can start whenever.
Cool. Hopefully I'm still audible. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the first thing I need to do is be very clear about what the comparative in this debate is. Because Jeff is lying to you when he tells you that the comparative is countries like Kenya and Uganda being able to sit at the United Nations and have a conversation with the United States of America and sing kumbaya. The alternative that opposition teams have to depend in this debate is an alternative of multipolarity. That is to say that other large hegemonic powers grow on their side, i.e., countries like China, countries like Russia, countries like North Korea also effectively take up systemic power. While these countries might also create and have regional trade blocs, they are still hegemonic within these blocs that exist. The alternative on their side is not a deconstruction of power and hierarchy within the globe, but it's simply hierarchy that is spread across a certain number of countries entirely. What this means is because the entire premise of that speech and that case is to say that equality and equity is important. They are bound to suffer from the very same harms that they tell you exist under a unipolar system. Multipolarity literally leads to the same harms, just by a different magnitude of actors. They really have no case to stand on. I think 3 things to do in response here. Firstly, why the United States unipolarity did not have an incentive to destroy peace. 3 reasons. 1, there is a structural and ideological constraint here. The analysis here is simply to say, unlike historical empires, the United States did not govern through territorial control, but through institutional and economic hegemony within the states. That meant that a system of consensual dependency existed. Its power was channeled through semi-independent institutions like the IMF, like the WTO, like the United Nations that they cry for, which institutionalized self-restraint. This meant that the United States could not simply act unilaterally without carrying reputational and economic costs because its currency and financial market and alliances all dependent on the stability of the international space. The analogy here is simple. Because the United States of America controlled what these systems and institutions look like, it meant that the dollar was also bound on ensuring that the whole globe maintained stability. Secondly, domestic and political economic incentives existed for order within that state. The US economy and politics were deeply tied to predictable global flow. That is to say, things like trade and global finances meant that instability destroyed the US wealth faster than it generated control in any case. There was no rational decision for the United States to ever ensure that there was no stability throughout the globe. The last thing is just democratic transparency and soft power constraint here. As a liberal democracy, the United States faces a lot of internal accountability, elections, media, civil society, etc., which limited their ability to have sustained imperial violence that oppositions tell you were likely to happen. I say it in the chat. The reason why all of this is important is because necessarily the alternative on their side, where you have a multipolar system, you are more likely to actually get abuse of these structures because you remove all these incentives that the United States historically had. I'm going to show you why opening opposition fails to deal with the case that V gives you. But before that, closing, go.
All right, so in your side of the house, is globalization divorced from the decline of unipolarity? Do you think without that decline, globalization would still have happened?
Yeah, sure. I think these two things are I don't think that necessarily these two things had to happen at the same time. Note, right at the end of the Cold War, the collective global consciousness literally started adopting things like the United States dollar. In fact, US hegemony was founded upon the idea of globalization taking place. Institutions that were meant to globalize the entire world started existing right at the start of the United States hegemony and the creation of that unipolar state. Optims can't just claim that globalization wouldn't have happened otherwise. Let's talk about what V gives you and how it goes unresponded to in this debate. Firstly, V explains to you how unipolarity prevents great power wars through structural deterrence in the first place. A unipolar system lacks ambiguity on who necessarily has power, which means that states know the ceiling of escalation and miscalculation is almost impossible on our side. In multipolarity, because relative power is uncertain, people preemptively militarize, they preemptively engage in proxy conflicts to ensure that they are able to sustain and gain more power. The reason why China was less likely to attack Taiwan and why Russia was less likely to attack Ukraine historically and post the Cold War was because they knew that there were likely repercussions. They are more able to do this in status quo where the system is multipolar and they equivalently have the ability to be aggressors and are assured that the United States is unlikely to retaliate and protect other countries because of the mutually assured destruction that opposition teams tell you are really good. I think the next thing here is also unipolarity sustains peace through global economic integration here. The US dominance guarantees that global economic public goods are met. That is to say, because the dollar is the reserve currency and the US Navy necessarily ensured that there was security in trade routes and the World Bank also existed as crisis stabilizers, we are more likely to ensure that like each financial market was based off of the other. There was a lack of an incentive to ensure that this was broken down. Multipolarity basically fragmented this into trade blocks, which meant that you had a rise in direct competition between things like the yen and the dollar, like the BRICS and G7, all of which have been weaponized interdependence and have ensured that it is easier to get into wars and conflicts with people outside of these very institutions. I think the next piece of extension here is it's really important to understand that necessarily the decline of unipolarity is precisely what has led in status quo to the existence of and voting in far-right populist governments throughout Europe and the United States. We say when unipolarity erodes, many voters experience status loss, economic insecurity, and perceived elite failure within their countries. That inherently creates fertile ground for populist and nativist and strongman appeals entirely. That means that multipolarity makes outsiders who promise decisive and protective action more attractive because they claim to restore order. The analysis here is simple. The people who opposition tell you are dangerous, like Donald Trump, are only voted in because unipolarity no longer exists. You need a far right leaning populist leader who promises you the idea idea that they can return you to dominance and ensure that they can take down rival blocks and trade realignment entirely in order for them to exist. That's why they are more likely to be voted in here. This presents a clear security threat. Multipolarity increases visible external threats, i.e., Chinese naval expansion and like Russian assertiveness. Populists exploit this fear by promising a tough response and stronger borders and military normalization. That appeal necessarily rewards authoritarian styles and decisiveness forms of leadership. That means you're more likely to get individuals who are virtually in every single one of these states more violent, more likely to engage in war, and more authoritarian in the nature in which they govern. This is important because it's the people who are more likely to praise individuals for being good war presidents instead of prioritizing actual stability. Note the comparative I give you at the height of my speech as to why stability is important for a unipolar nation to continue to exist. On the comparative, for a multipolar state, you need destability, you need authoritarian styles of leadership. Vote opening government.
Thanks. The PM inviting the yellow.
All right, am I audible?
Yeah.
So let me set up my timer and then I begin. I shall be taking closing government and CG. Okay. So, all right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think that this motion is very, very specific in 2 ways. Firstly, that it's a declines motion, and secondly, we are trying to predict the type of outcome we're expecting within the future. So we are looking to assess whether the chances increase to the extent where we are able to do a specific action. Our burden as opening opposition is to be able to prove that the decline in and of itself is something which is valuable for world peace. We do this in 2 metrics. Firstly, we prove that there is a rapid increase in terms of accountability and therefore utility, and I'm going to be proving how. But secondly, we prove that people's lives become intrinsically better, which means that they have no need to be able to fight each other. We think multipolarity could mean so many different things, as opening government tell you, like anything except us having one state in power. Whether it's going to be having all states becoming dominant, whether it's going to be having 50 states, as long as it's not one state being dominant, we think that's something which we are ready to buy into within the debate. A number of things which come from opening government. Firstly, they talk to you about the idea on how there's much more differing voices, and this in and of itself could mean that there's so many differing wars which exist on our side as a result of the perpetuation of these voices altogether. We think what you need to understand is that even in opening government side, states still have difference in terms of opinions, in terms of thoughts and ideologies in and of themselves. The difference is 2 things. Firstly, that they can't hold the United States to any form of accountability, but secondly, that they have to consistently wait and suppress their own ideas and expression, which means firstly that they feel underrepresented, which means that they cannot be able to air their voices, but secondly, it means that they either leave these institutions which they exist together with the United States, or work to be strong enough to be able to hurt the United States. Looks like how China and Russia have necessarily worked to be able to screw over the United States. So we don't think that difference is something which doesn't exist on government side. We think the aggregation and the anger that people then get as a result of it accumulating over years is actively worse on their side of the debate. But the second thing they then talk about, which is extremely crucial, is on the incentive which exists for states to necessarily intervene, in these proxy wars, especially because there are many powerful states and that kind of thing. Firstly, you need to understand that there's equal incentive on either end for states to be peaceful, regardless of whether it's multipolar or unipolar in this instance. This is because peace in and of itself, for any state, means more money. It means progression of industries. It means people who live within those countries necessarily have better standards of living and that kind of thing, which means much more chances of re-elections for those governments. But secondly, war literally means that even you as the president or the person who's making the decision could necessarily die. People could bomb you, which means then that self-protection is the most proximate human need that any individual, any leader who's looking to make this decision would necessarily go to, especially because leaders are likely to have the incentive not to engage within this war because they have a similar degree of understanding that this is something which is dangerous for them. We can all agree within today's debate that there's equal incentive on either end for people to necessarily not engage within these proxy wars in and of itself. We don't think they've been able to prove anything in terms of the delta. The first thing I'm going to be proving is on accountability and why that leads to more utility in and of itself. Here's the problem with the characterization we have within today's world. Firstly, we have states which feel so much underrepresented and less powerful as compared to the United States when it comes to much of these international institutions. Look at the Security Council, where vulnerable countries like within Africa necessarily feel left out. Look at the ICC, where so many countries don't exist, especially because they feel like the security and the power in and of itself is tilted towards the United States, and Trump could literally make a decision which affects you in that instance and that kind of thing. We think most of the times what happens is, as a retaliation, most states necessarily leave these institutions because they feel that their voices aren't always going to be heard, and that if they're not friends with the United States, then they're always going to be punished for that. But secondly, the second problem which exists within status quo is that international actors selectively, spread the definition of truth based on the bigger actor, which is the United States of America in this instance, just given the fact that it's a unipolar world in and of itself. We think they choose when to intervene, actors like the United Nations and all these powerful actors who can be able to create change, when to intervene, who to be able to prosecute if it's the ICC, and that kind of thing. But the third problem we have is that there's the danger of continuous harm and threat that the United States could screw you over anytime without any individual being able to hold them to account. This means then that so many states, so many countries are scared. Citizens within Kenya, Nepal, Madagascar often try to topple their government because of these United States of American and IMF policies, which are imposed on, or rather superimposed on, majority of these institutions which necessarily exist within the international framework, which means that millions of people are suffering as a result of this in and of itself. We think the remedy from opening opposition is two things. Firstly, to increase the accountability we could have within the debate, but secondly, to reduce the amount of time and magnitude that the United States of America has to be able to hurt this individual in and of itself. Why do we get the benefit of accountability on our side to the extent where we remove that one state from being in power? 5 mechanisms. Firstly, we think the realization of fallibility in and of itself, the fact that the United States was once a dominant actor, currently not a dominant actor now, is something which is evidence and a deterrent mechanism to so many leaders, that tomorrow you could try to be the big dog and try and bully everyone, but tomorrow literally the trend is showing that you're literally going to be screwed over by so many individuals. That realization of fallibility is a deterrent mechanism. Secondly, we say then that more states, more powerful states, are now watching each other. This means that they're acting as accountability mechanisms to check each other in this instance, and all that analysis about the mutually assured destruction, which means that most of these countries would not want to fuck up within the international geopolitical arena scene. But the fourth mechanism here is to say then that more nations feel like their voices are being heard, which means then that they are much more representative institutions, and they are less likely to fight. Why? Because they feel that their voices are being heard, as compared to a scenario where only the United States was one which was being heard in this instance. But fifthly, we say that importantly, these nations are necessarily stay and remain within these international institutions, which gives them the incentive to be able to follow the law. The problem, as I mentioned initially, is that more countries want to leave because they feel that this thing is not representative to them. We think that to the extent where we're able to prove accountability is a good thing, especially because you need to understand more clashes can be able to be won to the extent where we're able to prove that there's more accountability. Things like there's more peace, more utility, which means that people can be able to open up their borders for other benefits in and of itself. So, for example, you could be able to trade without fear and that kind of thing. We think the world is ultimately better in our side of the house. The second burden I'm going to take up is that people's lives become better, because if we prove this, then we prove that it's difficult for op-teams to necessarily prove why people have an incentive to necessarily fight. Because to the extent where people want peace, peace is good. Peace is something which preserves their lives, and it means that they can be able to actualize themselves and that kind of thing. So why does life become better when we remove this monopoly within the international geopolitical arena? Firstly, we think that people in and of themselves within these states feel like they're powerful enough and their voices are being heard. Secondly, we think that the bargaining power for these states necessarily increase. What you then understand is that more countries are ready to accept responsibility for historical and current atrocities. So, for example, the harms of colonization, the Jewish massacre, and all these different things, which means that there's more ability for vulnerable states to be able to get reparation. And thirdly, we think on utility. Listen to this final idea. The test for ideas always means that the world becomes a better place. Look at technology, the competition for trade, for arms, goods become better within status quo. People live better lives because you remove the monopoly, because singularly the United States. You remove trading using the dollar, which means that things within vulnerable states becomes cheaper, and we think you're able to hold the US to the account in this instance. They cannot be able to hold us ransom using one currency. Never been prouder. Opening opposition.
Well, I thank the deputy leader up, and thank everyone in top half, reminding people to take POIs and inviting MG.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Am I audible? Okay, because I'm using earphones. I didn't know how good it would be. POIs, just unmute and say POI, please don't badger. I'd like to go over a number of things. Right, okay. Starting in 3, 2, now. The biggest problem within opposition space is the lack of proper understanding of what a multipolar world is likely to look like. We don't think a multipolar world is one where someone who is currently not a global power and currently nowhere close to being a global power is likely to attain that sort of power. We don't think it's a world where they are likely to attain so much power. I think OG clarifies this. It's more likely that you have the continued dominance of, say, the countries that are currently very high, say the US, Russia, and China, but you likely also have a number of regional hegemons. I think like there are multiple examples of things. North Korea, things like UAE and Saudi Arabia's fight for dominance within the region. The reason why this context is incredibly important is that it proves importantly that accountability doesn't exist. And the very simple intuition form for this is that Russia and China versus everything that comes from the US versus everything that comes from what they call Russia and China. This is something that is likely to continue to happen because a giant empire probably doesn't want to die just like that. And it's very likely that emerging empires also have lots of incentives to want to push to get to that level. Let's talk about what the push is likely to look like and why it is likely to be bad. I think there are three places that people mostly compete in order to get global dominance. First one is things like technology. So having the better technology likely means things like, oh, you're able to produce more, you're able to produce better, but also transfer into things like your ability to wage war and cause conflict in various areas. Two things like economy and economic dependence. So the ability for your currency or just generally your economy to be so deeply entrenched in global systems, or at least your regional systems in the case of a multipolar world, where people are able where you are able to basically control what individuals do. But thirdly, like two things like culture and politics, so the ability for you to have states on your side, all of that jazz. Why do we think that these are places that are likely to then cause a further decline in world peace in a world where you have like less unipolarity? I think the first thing to talk about is that the race for technology is not something that often has things like ethics or often has things like limits. What it looks like is that both states are likely trying to challenge each other, see who's able to develop the best tech quickest. This often means that you are likely to say, get rid of things like human rights or care less about the people who are harmed in the process of doing this. And the intuition point of this is that we already have like we have precedents in what happened in the Cold War. We have precedents in what happened in the nuclear arms race and the race to space. What ultimately happens here is that multiple people suffer in the process of the emergence of a global power, but it also suffers in the death of one that is declining because you're ultimately going to want to let go of a lot of those limits to get it. But second thing to talk about, as regard tech, is that technology isn't just simply used for domestic purposes. So this is where you're likely to have things that already exist in several schools, by the way. For example, things like weaponizing technology in pervasive ways, monitoring, spying, using technology to wage energy warfare. That means that multiple people suffer and means that there is constantly a state of apprehension because each side wants to be more powerful than the other side. The reason why this is even more problematic is that every bit of militarization ultimately comes at the cost of regular citizens who are unable to then access basic resources that they ordinarily would have been able to access in a world where that's harsh competition did not exist. One. But two, that weapons don't just stick around. So it means that it's very likely that they're going to export this and sell this. Why do they have an incentive to do this? I think there's this idea that, oh, they wouldn't want to do it because their citizens will suffer and they could get bored. Like the vast majority of wars that are fought between regional powers and even global hegemons never actually happen on their own soil. The US has barely had anything happen to it in all those times. It was more likely that you're likely to have proxies and the constant attempts to flip governments, either using direct political influence, economic manipulation, or things like covert operations, like say you want to topple a government, like what the entirety of the US did during the Cold War. What is this likely to look like, especially in today's world, where there are a huge number of people who are non-aligned or militant groups who are willing to take up arms to whoever is willing to pay them the most? It looks like you generally increase the level of harm that is likely to happen in society because you create a world where these countries have an incentive to continue to fund like anti-state and extra state parties in order for them to cause violence that then allows them to either intervene directly or gain certain benefits over them. Why is this significantly worse in a multipolar world? Because within a world that has like more unipolarity, it's more likely that the evident threat of one huge power is likely to then say stop individuals from doing so. In a world where you have less of that, like global hegemony, it's more likely that the fight between individuals is going to aggravate. So what it looks like is that the US funds people to like have legacy action in one space. China tries to counterfund them. Other people do this. Why is this then incredibly important? Because it means that the harms that you create there are harms that are more proximate to people on the ground. What happens in a unipolar world is that because nobody can challenge the US in terms of military power, since you're more likely to have things like economic settings and all of those other things, it means that nobody ever goes to the extreme of militarization, or at least the most extreme of causing proxy wars elsewhere, because you know that the US is capable of attacking you directly. The world where that threat no longer exists, or where you have constant escalation of things like arms and all of these things, you're more likely to have people reverting to those other means because the consequences are very minor. Why would accountability never exist then? because states are more likely to want to hold on to their power at any point in time. This means that you're very much likely to forgive the excesses of the state that is aligned to you as long as it keeps them within your same fold. What this looks like is states like saying that, oh, you're not going to look at harms that happen in specific countries because those countries are on your side, and you're going to say that they're not as bad. The reason why this is then problematic is that it means that you continually have people who take advantage of the power vacuums, or at least the weaker accountability systems that exist within the decline of unipolarity. I think like an intuition form for this is what currently happens in like between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, where there's there's an entirety of the war being fought in Sudan because of these people's interests, where they back either people. But because the US is declining, it has very little incentive to then denounce its own partners taking this action. And because China wants to upgrade, they have very little incentive to do something. What then happens is that in the areas where these big powers are likely to vacate, you're more likely to have like more and more wars, especially at a lower scale, and one that likely affects people more. By comparison, in a world where you have unipolarity, it's less likely that you have war in the first place, but two, it's less likely that you have long drawn out wars that happen between proxies where there's obviously the most egregious of harms. Because yes, the intuition form. If the US is sending troops to the Middle East, it's possible and likely that it will be able to be held accountable, at least to some extent. In a world where it is not either of them, it's nameless rebel groups. It is people who cannot directly be traced to anybody. You have more harms. The next thing to talk about here is that you don't just gain economic power just like that. Like countries are not just going to start minting more money and all of a sudden become very good. The most proximate way by which countries gain a lot of economic power is through things like resource extraction and manufacturing. I think that you already see the problem of that happening right now with China's continued support of Rwanda in its like what they call it, in its farms within Congo, because it allows him to easily extract things like cobalt and other precious minerals. The reason why this becomes extremely more problematic is that you're probably in limited places you can get this, which means that you always have an incentive for these countries to, in order to exert and increase their economic dominance, either to match these current states or to see them, we always have that incentive to continue to push into all of these states. What we think is more likely here is that because of this lack of independence and because of this extreme competition, it's less likely that you have cohesive regulation in the first place. So what it looks like is that the US is likely going to ban products from China, and like the US is likely going to relax its own regulations in order to make sure that technology develops even faster. But the faster development of technology often comes at the expense of regular people, but also often worsens the system by which war happens. Why does this win the debate? I think the first thing to look at here is where are you more likely to have wars and where are wars likely to be worse? Because most wars are ultimately just wars for things like world peace. I think that's in a world where you have plenty powers who are constantly tussling for all like hegemony. Because again, a multipolar world barely ever says that because everybody wants to become the dominant force. This means that you're more likely to have even more violence, but you're less likely to have the accountability to prevent it. Proud, my time up.
Yeah, your time is up. Thanks,
Sorry,
Andrew.
proud MG. Wasn't looking at my time.
Thanks, Andrew, inviting Amo. Number Bob.
So yeah, I just want my partner to be able to speak. The problem is, since he wasn't able to hear anything, it would be better if he remembered and gave the extension rather than just trying to respond as whip. So I was trying to see if he can reconnect and then speak. At least he can give the extension without responding. So I don't know if you could just give us more time, to be honest, because he wasn't able to listen to anything. And last time he tried to speak, no one was able to hear him. So just, I don't know, 1-2 more minutes. Let's just see if we can reconnect and try to speak.
Okay. But is there a possibility for you to like iron person? Colin?
Yeah, based on CAP's policy, that might really affect. I think that might affect our rankings. I'm honestly not 100% sure what that policy was. I get it kind of, but I think they said it affects our chances of like winning the round, something like that. Maybe CAP could confirm.
Yeah, Takura, I know it's like kind of tricky given that member didn't listen to like anything, but
I'm trying to reach out to your partner and find out what's going to happen. But based on our policy, you still debate then you automatically get a photo on both panels.
Um, Collins is like, is there an option for like, I want to know outcomes is it like possible to move the debate somewhere else besides Discord?
Sorry, I just want to ask and confirm because I think Davida said you're allowed to iron one round, and that round you still get whatever ranking you would have gotten. Then when you iron a second round, that's when you get an automatic fourth.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
I might be
This
already
would
I
be
might
iron
be
round one.
this would be our second round. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Takura, is it like possible to move the debate somewhere else?
Okay, I think the debate could move, but I'll just like also ask because there's a possibility of moving and they can still not hear on any other platform anyway. So I don't know. Can the partner like do
All
a
right.
dry run
Yeah,
with them?
I've asked Smart to see if Google Meet can work, and he says yes. So hopefully we could try that. If every other speaker agrees to that, please. Thanks.
Okay, fine. That's okay.
Yeah, that's cool with CO. Like, let's just proceed. CG rather.
OG, are you guys good?
All right. So Chair, if that's all right, please you could just send the link for the G
Yeah,
Meet.
yeah. It's OG and OO cool with this, and the rest of the panels, and B and A.
Yeah,
I'm
OG is fine with
fine
it.
with it.
Yeah, we're good. Let's just move it.
Yeah.
Sure, I've posted the link in the chat. I'll go there and open it myself.
Hello. I do not see the link.
Yeah, because you're looking at the wrong chat. Give me one moment to post it on the voice channel. Okay. I posted it as well, so you can join, or you should join. Sorry. I'll let everyone in very soon. Sorry. I'm struggling to tech. Settings.
you